Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for World Day Against Trafficking in Peoples. We'll be presenting this in a webinar format, which means your videos and microphones will be off, so we won't be able to hear you. It's okay, you can continue on with being a bit noisy in the background if you need to, but if you've got any questions, type them in the Q&A box down the bottom of the screen, and we'll be directing those questions to Carolyn and Brian after they've presented. So welcome everyone. I'm Sylvia Howes from Data4Good. I've got Samantha and Kiani behind the scenes managing the webinar, and between us we're hosting from the lands of the Darawal, Wongal and Gadigal clans of the Eora Nation. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands which we are gathering from today, and the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander and Maori people attending the webinar. We pay our respects to their elders past, who nursed country and cared for the lands for many years. We pay our respects to their present elders, who continue to pass on knowledge and provide guidance that we can all learn from. And we pay our respects to emerging community elders. We hope they continue to find means through which their voices are heard and registered. And we celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal and Maori peoples and appreciate that we have these beautiful cultures to connect with. We look forward to building that connection and working towards not just inclusion, but empowerment of our Indigenous brothers and sisters. So keep an eye out tomorrow when we're opening up registration for our Indigenous Peoples Day webinar, which will be held on the 10th of August. Today we recognise the UN's World Day Against Trafficking in Persons. Trafficking is born from slavery, which has existed in Australia and around the world throughout history, from being institutionalised down to the level of individuals acting out of situations of desperation. I personally cannot fathom withholding freedom from someone. When people become objects of trade, despite having the same thoughts and emotions, as well as what should be the rights to freedom as everyone else. With progress in technology and collaborations, there have been huge advancements in freeing those from conditions of slavery, as well as raising global awareness. And through this progress, there arises hope. So to hear more about the progress being made, first up today, we'll hear from Carolyn Liaw. Carolyn has a passion around ensuring fair work conditions, and that passion has guided her career, leading to her role as researcher and project lead at Anti-Slavery Australia, where she coordinates their policy and reform work and law reform work. Anti-Slavery Australia is a legal, research and policy centre at the University of Technology, Sydney. They provide free legal and migration support to survivors of modern slavery in Australia and are currently assisting hundreds of people across Australia. So welcome, Carolyn.
Thank you. Thank you for having Anti-Slavery Australia join this webinar today. It's wonderful to be part of this initiative. So in terms of, I'll sort of step through what we mean by human trafficking. So often there's quite a lot of confusion around what is human trafficking. It's often used interchangeably with slavery and modern slavery. So human trafficking, people might be surprised to learn, still happens in Australia. Essentially, it's the recruitment or movement or harbouring of someone using coercion, threat or deception for the purposes of exploitation. And so that's where we see the link to the other forms of modern slavery, such as slavery, forced labour, forced marriage. So at the end of that trafficking journey, people find themselves in a form of exploitation. It's also important to note that people can be trafficked into, out of and within Australia, which often people find quite surprising as well. And human trafficking is also more than just sex trafficking or trafficking within the sex industry. So often people automatically think of sex work or trafficking into the sex work industry. However, in Australia, we see more cases in other industries. So it's industries that people interact with on a day-to-day basis. So we're looking at people being trafficked into restaurants, cafes, your local shop, farms, and domestic work inside private homes would be another example as well. So in terms of Anti-Slavery Australia, we work with survivors of all forms of modern slavery within Australia, and we have been doing so since 2003. We have been seeing increasing numbers of people being identified as having been trafficked and also having experienced modern slavery within Australia. So currently we're working with over 300 clients all across Australia, and they're people who have experienced all forms of modern slavery, which includes forced labour, forced marriage, servitude and bonded labour as well. So our clients come from all around the world. Usually we're looking at sort of 30 to 40 different countries of origin, but it's also important to note that we also work with a lot of Australian citizens and permanent residents as well in this space. In terms of work that we're doing in the data space, there's quite a lot of interesting projects all across the world in terms of the use of data in the modern slavery space. There's quite exciting initiatives around particularly the sort of heat mapping of factories that potentially use slave labour. So at ASA, we don't have such grand data projects. We have used recently a lot of social media data. So a lot of the work that we do involves connecting with community workers and frontline responders who are often the sort of first point of contact or the type of people who are able to identify potential survivors within Australia. So what we have been able to do is use social media data to sort of reach out to people in those sectors to raise awareness around modern slavery within Australia. Because we do know that awareness of modern slavery in Australia is still relatively low. So when we go out and undertake our sort of outreach and education activities with all sorts of community workers, people are often surprised to learn of modern slavery. So it's very important for us that we engage with community workers to raise awareness that modern slavery exists in Australia, what it might look like, how to identify it, and then also connecting them with services for the survivors in terms of a response. We're also currently looking at potentially how we can use social media data to engage with young people. So we have a lot of passionate young people who approach us and are interested in advocating on modern slavery. So we're looking at how do we better engage with young people, and what's that sort of tipping point in terms of having someone engaged on an issue, but what's the next sort of step? What's that tipping point in terms of getting someone to take action on an issue? So that's something that we're currently exploring at the moment as well. And then recently, or in 2018, Australia passed a Modern Slavery Act. And so that requires organisations with annual turnover in excess of 100 million in Australia to report on the actions that they're taking to address modern slavery within their organisations and their supply chains. So that potentially has a really big reach and scope in terms of assisting people that are in modern slavery all across the world. So as part of that, we're looking at how can we collect or track increasing awareness, or we hope increasing awareness of modern slavery amongst businesses over time, and particularly their employees as well. So how can we collect that data, and then how can we report on it in a meaningful way? So some of that will involve collecting and looking at data through our education activities and training activities that we're currently undertaking with a range of businesses who are required to report under this new Act. But we're always looking for new ways to sort of map out increasing levels of awareness, not just amongst businesses, but also amongst community workers as well. So they're just some of the things that we're working on at this point in time. And I'll probably leave it at that for the moment, Sylvia.
Great. Can you tell us, Carolyn, can you just tell us a little bit more about how you, with the social media data, like what sort of data you collect, how you have access to it, and what you can do once you've got that data?
Yeah, so what we do is pre-COVID times, we undertook a lot of face-to-face engagement activities. And so with that, we look at the types of community workers that we engage with. So what types of organisations do we engage with? What sectors do they come from? So often we're looking at quite diverse sectors. So for example, you're looking at people who work in the domestic and family violence services, people who work in the migrant, refugee and people seeking asylum type services, migrant resource centres, community legal centres. So we look at the types of individuals who we undertake face-to-face engagement with, or who request face-to-face training, which usually is a whole range or host of community workers and sectors. And then we work with a social media organisation to sort of map out those particular sectors and community organisations, and then they use that to sort of target those types of workers or employees or community workers through social media. So I'm not sure exactly what goes on in that sort of social media space, but they use the data that we have from our face-to-face contacts, and they try to reach those same sort of types of cohorts through sort of through Instagram and Facebook predominantly. And so that's like a sort of really new and exciting space, because we had never thought about that before we approached the organisation and sort of asked about how do we raise awareness with these particular cohorts. And that's a really interesting way to engage with people who potentially can help identify more victims and survivors within Australia.
Yeah, it's amazing what you can do with all the social media these days. There's a lot of pros and cons, and it's really great to see when you can take advantage of the pros and really help out. So we might ask, we'll save a couple of questions for after Brian's presentation. So thanks, Carolyn. I'll keep you around, and we'll have a bit of a chat afterwards. But in the meantime, I'll just introduce Brian. And with Brian, so we had a fantastic chat when I first met Brian. And if they say a picture tells 1,000 words, then accounts of Brian's firsthand experiences could fill a library. He spent 6 years in the Australian Army, 13 years as a federal agent, and the last 18 years specialising in counter-slavery operations around the world in 50 countries. Brian is the founder and CEO of international NGO Slavefreetrade, a startup tech NGO building a global community of organisations wanting to deal in goods and services proved to have harmed nobody in the making. Brian, over to you to tell us more.
This is the first time I think I've unmuted myself at the right time. These webinars are always rather complicated, so thanks very much for the introduction. And thanks, Caroline, for setting the groundwork for the definitions and things like this. So I started Slave Free Trade 3.5 years ago, and one of the reasons for doing that was a result of the previous 17 years of really quite frustrating experiences on the ground. Every person I rescued is replaced by 4. We're just increasing slavery by doing these sorts of things. We don't even take a longitudinal approach to understanding the implications of rescues. And we're destroying entire communities. Risk assessment is often the go-to. Risk assessment is a blunt instrument, and I've had contact even just recently during coronavirus with companies who have been cut out of contracts, 1,900 people unemployed overnight because they've been cut out of contracts by risk assessment tools. So we're not very clever, let's be frank. We are not tackling slavery in the same way that we have tackled, or we're not learning the lessons that we've learned from other operations. So I used to be a counter-narcotics guy. So one of the things we learned very early in the counter-narcotics days was that supply is infinite. We really need to be working on the demand side and working to create systemic change, market change. So that's why slave-free trade, there's too little being done on demand side. So what we do with slave-free trade, it's arguably a tech project. So we combine two very big pieces of work. One is using international human rights law to create a universal definition of decent work. We use that international definition, that universal definition, specifically because it doesn't care about product, good or service, organization type, geography, jurisdiction, local legislation. It doesn't care about any of those things because it's derived from international human rights law. So it's agnostic. So then, once we'd identified all the points of international human rights law that speak to decent work, we've compiled it. That's compiling a definition. So then we turned those standards from international human rights law into indicators. Indicators are the things you would look for in a workplace to say this is decent work or not. And then questions for each of those. So we ended up with a universal set of questions. You ask whether you're in a plantation in Guatemala or a bank office in New York. The questions are your experiences and your observations. The idea being to get a 360-degree view of workplaces. So the international human rights law framework was the very first big piece of work. Then we needed to operationalize that. How do we get these questions out to people in a way that we can automate the process and scale it? So effectively automating what I was doing as an agent in the field, going out and speaking to people. How do we automate that? Because until we automate it, we can't scale it. If we can't scale it, we're not getting anywhere near the numbers we're talking about, because we are talking about tens of millions of people in conditions of very poor human rights. So the automation of that is where we are now. This is the technology. So we're building, I call it a distributed human rights intelligence system. The best way to think about this is we collect data over here, we analyze and aggregate in the middle, and we distribute the information. Now, these are all very important pieces in a behavioral system. The distribution in particular is important because if we just collect the data, analyze it, and put the results out there as awareness raising, then we are not communicating viable information, viable intelligence to those people whose decisions can be influenced by that information. So the distribution of the information is really important. So it has to be distributed. At the moment, a decision is being taken by a particular audience member. So in our system, when we're talking about the products of modern slavery, the belt you're wearing at the moment, your shoes, your phone, the coffee you're drinking, all of these are tainted with modern slavery at the moment. So consumers, when they're buying their coffee, at point of sale, if you get the information to them that we've aggregated from workplaces, at that moment, they will change their buying decision. There is 100% consumer conversion to slave-free coffee when they're ordering their coffee. There is 100% consumer conversion to the slave-free t-shirt at the time, if the information is delivered at the time the consumer is considering the buy. So the timing of the information is important. The type of information is important. Consumers don't trust labels anymore. Consumers don't trust retailers anymore. Other audiences are public procurement, for example, governments buying t-shirts and army boots. They also don't trust their suppliers anymore because 77% of companies have modern slavery in their supply chain and none admit it during a public procurement procedure, during bidding. So there's a differential there between 77% and zero, correct? So information to public procurement agencies at the time they're doing the evaluation is crucial. And once you do that, give that information at the time of the evaluation, there is a 100% conversion again to the organizations that are human rights compliant as opposed to the bidders that are not. So there are massive challenges in all of this, of course, but data is key. We are aiming we weren't deliberately aiming, but we are going to be the world's richest data set on human rights intelligence in workplaces. When one apex company joins our system and we start asking questions, we ask 100 questions a year of every single person in every single workplace in an organization. Because supply chains and business networks expand, they multiply dramatically. One apex company joins. An apex company is a multinational. One apex company joins. Within 12 months of that company joining, there are more than 1 billion data points in that one company's chain alone. So we're talking about a wealth of information that, you talk about heat maps, for example, a wealth of information that can give you incredible live heat maps of what does freedom of association look like in Bangladesh? What does sexual harassment look like in Sydney? What does gender pay gap look like across the United States, for example? So it's a very important data set. We're at very early days, so we're only just in pilot now, and we're still trying to build the tech. We're a volunteer NGO, so we are moving as fast as volunteer NGOs do, which, as most of you know, is not so fast. Anyway, I've talked enough. Maybe that's enough for an introduction.
I'm happy for you to keep going because we just had a question through that's very relevant. If the customers don't trust the labels, how can we share the information of a slave-free product? So
we have part of our theory of change, and this is based on my experience in the field. I was taking a lot of notes while I was out there. And part of my theory of change is that there are 3 broken trust relationships we need to fix if we're going to tackle modern slavery. The first one is between consumers and retailers. The second one is between retailers and wholesalers and their suppliers. And the third one is between employers and employees. And we all see in our everyday work the lack of trust or the problems around trust in workplaces between employer and employee. It's always topical. It's always interesting to see companies that don't trust their staff and vice versa. On the consumer retailer side, it's really interesting. One of the ways of helping people trust and understand is immersion. So one of the very important, let's say, product requirements in what we're building on the consumer side is that they can see the data. They can see live, real-time, the data, and they can be immersed. So our consumer app, which is still in design, our consumer app is you scan the barcode of the beans at the cafe, or you scan the barcode of the chocolate bar in the supermarket. And the app queries our system and identifies that that product is in the system, comes from a supply chain where the workplaces are all human rights compliant. The product should have a label on it, but there's always a time lag between what the system knows and what packaging changes happen. But in any case, you can scan the barcode of anything and it'll look up the system and see if the barcode is there. And if it is, it brings you into the platform. It brings you the live data coming from the platform. It starts with a map of the world with a supply chain map. So you're sitting in a cafe in Sydney and you're drinking your cup of joe and you scan the barcode of the beans because the shop has committed to make the beans available to you to scan the barcode so you can see the live proof. And the map comes up of the supply chain. You can see the human rights performance of the entire chain. You can't see the name and address of each of the companies in that supply chain because for commercial sensitivity reasons, if we want companies to do this, they need to be sure that they are not being cut out and they're not giving information to competitors, et cetera, et cetera. But you can see every workplace's human rights performance. So we distinguish in our system between visibility and transparency. Visibility is seeing everything, like the facts of the contact person of that company in tier 3 of the supply chain, or the name of that company, or the address of that company. Transparency is understanding everything. Transparency is the human rights performance of the workplace. So what we've done is we've actually filtered. We use a thing called 1 degree of separation rule, so that if you are more than 1 degree separated from the entity that you're looking at, you can't see the detailed information about that workplace, facts of it, the name, the address, the contact person, but you still see 100% the human rights transparency. So a consumer sees in their map, beautiful enriched map, which will be brought to us by Mapbox collaboration, that shows each of the workplaces' human rights performance along that chain, shows the aggregate score for the chain and shows individual workplaces. And for each of those workplaces, if they want to, we will be building a multimedia feature. So right down at if it's a single being Guatemalan, then you can take a video tour of the plantation, for example. And then we're instituting in one of our blockchain elements, we're instituting a tipping function. So you're sitting in the cafe, drinking your coffee, you've scanned the beans, while you've been drinking your coffee, you're perusing the map and see the journey those beans took to you. So this is really important, actually, because it opens up to the eyes of the world, the journey, the incredible journey that products are taking from point A to point B. If you're buying this coffee from Guatemala, it could have been literally all over the world before it gets to you. Same prawns. If you're buying prawns in a supermarket freezer in Sydney, they could easily have been back and forth from the United States, Europe, and Asia 2 or 3 times before they get to you. So I think that is going to be really quite valuable in itself, to open the world's eyes to what's going on in supply chains, the impact of globalization, and you wonder why our planet has problems when there are planes and ships going 2 and 3 times around the world to bring us the blueberries that were picked in Chile last week. So anyway, I digress.
Hey, Brian, can I just
Yes.
quickly get you to explain another problem with prawns? You were telling me when we spoke about the human impact of some of the prawn farming things, for those who might not be aware of some of the issues with that.
Well, in fact, my journey to slave-free trade started with my first forced labor case, which was a 12-year-old boy who was shot in the face and dumped overboard. When I went to investigate, we finally found out what had happened. And he was on a prawn boat, and he was shot with his 2 friends. They were all shot and dumped overboard. His was the only body that washed up, so that's how we knew about it. The prawns from that boat ended up in supermarket freezers in Paris. And there's lots of interesting things just come from that story. The first one is, of course, I just said, no, screw this. This is not going to be, this can't continue, right? This has just got to stop. So then I started going boots and all into rescues and the like. And then, but some of the really important features of this is that those prawns, they went to port in Thailand at the same price as the prawns from a boat full of free men. I say men because it's all men, right? So a boat full of free men and a boat full of slaves. They're selling their prawns at the first port of sale for the same price, $10 a kilo, whether they're caught by slaves or not. There is no market differentiation. There is nobody at point of sale, the first point of sale, that understands the difference and can differentiate between the two. And that lack of differentiation occurs right through the supply chain to the freezers, so that you as a consumer have 2 bags of prawns in front of you, and you have no idea whether it's been caught by the freemen or caught by the boat with slaves. So the idea of slave-free trade is to introduce that market differentiator, so that you, the consumer, can say, well, I'm going to buy the bag of prawns that says that it's caught in freedom. And when you do that, you're signaling the retailer, that's where my buying preference is, I'm going to pay that. And you may pay more for it, but of course, in theory, you don't need to, because from the point of sale, they are the same price. Slave-free should not cost more than the slave-made. The $14 t-shirt is still a $14 t-shirt. And if you look at the way profits are absorbed within that t-shirt, more than 80% of that is going to the retailer and the first level wholesaler. The cost of making, which is of course where the slavery comes in most often, the cost of making is so small, a small increase at that point has absolutely no effect on the retail price, unless the retailer wants to pass it on to the consumer, and then they can increase it. And if you talk about luxury goods, and 82% of consumers high-end consumers would pay more for slave-free. The crazy thing there is they've got the same scarf as the company next door. They've just got a 4,000% markup. Now, if you're talking about the impact of, if you're talking about the claim that slave-free is more expensive than slave-made, let's talk about the 4,000% impact, but 4,000% markup, and the impact of a price increase at that lowest level of that supply chain where that silk came from, for example. It's not. I've gone on again. I keep talking.
That's what you're here for. It's very harrowing to hear the stories, and sort of really, like when we talk about, like in what I do, I talk about data all the time, but data is different to people. And so it's really interesting to hear that you're giving it this transparency, visibility and transparency into what's happening, and a lot of the time we're not aware of that. And
data is so important, right? We've been, up until now, we've been doing I don't know how many poster campaigns, for example, that I've evaluated over the years. I was sitting in Armenia at a border checkpoint with Georgia, and the border checkpoint on the inside was plastered with posters about you could be a victim of trafficking, call this hotline if you end up in trouble, and all of these, you know, the money that is spent on these systems and these posters, for example, is just insane. Nobody crossing the border from Armenia, this was aimed at the trafficking of girls from Armenia to Georgia, ultimately to Russia and the United Arab Emirates, UAE. And no girl at that point who's coming to that border crossing thinks of themselves as a potential victim of human trafficking. They don't look at the poster. And if they do look at the poster, they're not going to note the number. And if they do note the number, they're going to be in trouble on the Georgian side because the Georgians know the number. So we're doing all sorts of insane things like this. We've really got to look much harder at the impact of what we're doing, the actual impact of what we're doing, and design things that aren't having the right effect. Design away from things that aren't having the right effect. I think we need to reevaluate these. Data is super crucial for us going forward because we can really communicate to change people's buying decisions. A public procurement agency getting the right data at the right point will change their evaluation. Same with ethical consumers. Same with investors. 75% of impact investors want to know whether their money is going into slave-free, going into slave-made or not. They want to know about the human rights compliance. But at the moment, the sustainability rating system is the only thing they have to work with. And that is a third-party report of a company's self-assessment.
Yeah.
That's how low the bar is, right? So data, live data at the right moment is so important and valuable. It can be a massive game changer here.
Yeah. And so some companies, you know, with like super companies looking to invest more ethically, so some companies are seeing it as a real financial benefit, whereas other companies like I imagine still a lot of financial motivation to keep some of the data hidden. And where do you get your data from in that case?
Well, we're a completely voluntary system. So a company joining our scheme, if you like, wants to be demonstrating their good. So we are building a global gated community of good actors wanting to reward each other to create a kind of a new economy where instead of 80% of what you're buying having slavery behind it, we want to invert that economy and have an economy where 80% is made in freedom, proved made in freedom. So organizations that join Slave-Free Trade, it's purely voluntary. They want to be transparent. They want to be seen as good. And the reasons are myriad, right? They could be, there's an automotive company that wants to join because they want to turn the page on their emissions scandal. No name is mentioned. So there's a chocolate company that wants to join because they want to be the world's first slave-free chocolate instead of the other companies that talk about it and just have thoughts and prayers in mind. There are other companies that join because they actually give a damn about their staff and they're so close to their staff. They want to be seen by their staff as doing the right thing and seen by the world as doing the right thing by their staff. So all sorts of different great reasons to do it, but it's got to be companies that want to join. So in the investment world you're talking about, the way we get in there is through, for example, sustainability ratings, where suddenly you're able to see within those sustainability ratings that there is live proof of the S in the ESG in the fund that you're investing in. You're able to see which of the companies in the fund you're going to put your money into. Say there's a managed fund that you're about to put your money into, you're a pension fund manager. You're looking at that pension fund, you're evaluating, you get a sustainability rating on that fund. Can you imagine the power of seeing of that 4,500 companies that are in that fund that you're investing in? You see a little blue hand icon next to the companies that are human rights compliant. Yeah. Or the fund itself is only for human rights compliant companies, for example, which is something we're working on now. The power of that is phenomenal. And investors, as I said, 75% of impact investors want to be able to do this. They are they're desperately scratching their heads for a way to identify the good from the bad, how to identify sort the wheat from the chaff. And a very simple, intuitive icon next to a company name to say that it's human rights compliant, and then the proof, the live proof, the data online of what's going on in that supply chain or in that company. That's really viable information, but it requires live data. It requires a lot of data.
Yeah, I'm going to throw a question over to Carolyn on that. With trafficking occurring across a range of industries and communities, are you seeing with your data that there's particular segments that are the main offenders? I say offenders is in potential to change their habits.
I think it's widely acknowledged that human trafficking and modern slavery can happen in any sector or industry. In terms of the most concerning we have in Australia, it's probably around domestic workers, because they're working within people's homes. That's really difficult to identify individuals, and we have had quite a number of cases looking at people who've been working within homes for years and years and years, being locked in. Nobody knows that they're there. When the family goes away for holidays, the individual's locked in the home with limited food or provisions, and they're not paid during that time. So domestic workers are probably one of the big groups that we're concerned about in Australia. It is also an issue all around the world in terms of domestic workers, given the low levels of visibility in terms of working within people's homes. But we are seeing a lot of forced labour type cases across a range of industries, agriculture, so farms within Australia, having lots of workers living and working generally through labour hire companies. So not directly with the farmers, but where you're involving additional players. There's a number of issues or concerns around that. But we have seen people working in restaurants and cafes, even in sort of metropolitan cities. So, you know, in high trafficked, high visibility areas in inner Sydney, we have had cases in those situations as well. So there are particular sectors that are perhaps more riskier than others, but it's always important to be aware that modern slavery can happen in any sector or industry.
Yeah, and with with identifying that, you're going to groups through social media and other methods to ask questions. What questions are you asking, and what sort of responses and trends are you discovering?
In terms of working with community workers, so what we find is that a lot of some people are identified because they've managed to exit the situation, so exit a home, and they're just found in distress at the bus stop or on a train. And so a member of the public has taken them to a local shelter or a migrant resource centre, who have then sort of had a look around either online, or they either receive some training around modern slavery, because the reality is, as Brian said, no one generally identifies as, you know, I've been trafficked or I'm in forced labour. It's looking at what those warning signs are. So a lot of those warning signs will relate around work and decent work. So if you're looking at people who don't have freedom of movement within the workplace, people living and working at the same place, or living at a place provided by their employer, people who, if they're migrant workers, have their passports or other identity documents taken away, people working excessive hours, people not being paid or being paid minimally. So there's a sort of continuum of exploitation, or a continuum of the workplace experience. And so you've got decent work on one side, and then you've got slavery at the extreme end on the other, and it's looking at that sort of in-between area where people find themselves potentially in for a whole range of reasons. So it's being able to have members of the public or community workers identifying what those sort of red flags are, to then be able to provide support to a potential person at risk.
Yeah. And just
is it possible I can something Carolyn said there is super important about the way we conceptualize modern slavery and human rights in workplaces, is this idea that there is decent work at one and modern slavery at the other. It's so important to get that, to understand that that's true. It's a continuum. So the way we visualize it is we have 10 principles. So no forced labor, no child labor, freedom from discrimination, occupational health and safety, fair pay and equality and things like this. So these are the 10 principles of that are human rights in workplaces. And we think of them as 10 escalators in a supermarket, in a department store, 10 escalators. Each principle is an escalator. So where you are as a company, you are on one of the steps on that escalator. Now, do you want to be a company going up the escalator or down the escalator? Down the bottom end is the murky pool of modern slavery. Up the top is the beautiful utopia of decent work. And so what we're doing is actually telling you which step on each of those 10 principles you are currently on, based on the 3 data sets that we're collecting. And then, are you moving up the escalator or down the escalator on any of those 10? Well, in fact, we monitor for 100 indicators. So Carolyn also mentioned this idea of you use indicators to tell what's going on. If there's incredible stuff that you can actually determine from it. For example, if there's no toilet paper in the toilets in the workplace you're in, it's actually an indicator of really pretty poor conditions. It's an indicator of other stuff. So indicators are crucial because they tell us, without knowing the definition of modern slavery, the definition of trafficking, the definition of legal minimum wage, without knowing any of these technical definitions, it's the indicators exposed to us, the experiential and observational realities of the person in the workplace. That's revealing. That's where we determine what the real situation is. So where you are on these escalators is crucial. So the idea is, you're on an escalator, you're on that step, putting a number on it, being able to quantify human rights in workplaces suddenly gives us the ability to measure and to be able to promote change. So you're a 63 on occupational health and safety in the workplace this year. According to your contract, by next year, you have to be 64 or better. Continuous improvement is possible in workplaces. To get everybody moving up is the point.
Yeah. And I think you sort of answered what was going to be my next question, which was like looking at things like shared transport apps and fruit picking. Sometimes depending on the conditions is seen as a form of modern day slavery, and continuous improvement so important. And how do you, like when you've got that these technologies are also like, well, not necessarily with fruit picking, but with some of the apps, that the technologies are so new that they don't have regulations around it. So you've got an employee's feeling within their workplace, but how else can you measure that workplace is not just compliant with laws that possibly don't exist yet, but that it is a slave-free workplace, and encourage them to be higher up on those steps of the escalator as you describe it, Brian?
Well, this is why the indicators are not rooted in international definitions or legal definitions of, for example, human trafficking, because nobody knows that they're human trafficked usually. Nobody knows that they're actually in slavery. Many people just in slave-like conditions don't really understand what's frankly going on about them and what the relativity is. Everything's relative. So the indicators need to be about you are asking them to provide to you information about how they're seeing their workplace and how they're experiencing their workplace. And the importance of the two of those is really crucial. The difference is with experiential and observational questions. So this is an old enforcement technique, right? Investigation technique. You don't just ask somebody about their situation, you ask somebody else about their situation. And so think of it like bank security. You've seen the movies with the lasers going across the bank floor. If you're asking someone their experiences, then it's just a couple of lasers going across the room in a very obvious pattern. What you're not getting is the cross-cutting. You're not getting the interlinkage. So you ask experiential and observational, and suddenly you've got a 360-degree view. You've got these lasers across the bank floor that are all cutting across each other. So you're getting a really good view of a workplace. And of course, the more people in a workplace that are participating, the higher the sample rate, of course, the better the result. So we've got a built-in threshold of 99% confidence interval, 4% margin of error for every workplace. So you don't get a verified response in our system. So it's a live licensing system. And the system doesn't give you a live license to carry the name slave-free or made in freedom unless you're hitting those thresholds. So, you know, the standard's got to be very, very high. And anything less demands remediation, demands let's work to fix that.
And just on that, someone's asked specifically, I don't know if, how technical we can go into it, but has blockchain been used to map the supply chain journey?
Blockchain is being used all over the place for supply chain related projects. So we were one of the first movers in the social impact world on blockchain. In 2017, we were one of the world's top 10 thought leaders on social impact blockchain. And one of the things we learned very quickly was that blockchain was not a solution to what we're trying to achieve. Blockchain promises to bring some really interesting strength and credibility to what we are doing, to parts of what we are doing, but it cannot provide an end-to-end solution. So the blockchain application for supply chains tends to be creating a flow chart, locking that flow chart in, and locking in conditions about products. And so behind that, there is always a track and trace element. So putting a tag on that tuna to be able to, and that tag continuing right through the supply chain. And blockchain can be used to track where that tag goes, when it enters a workplace, when it leaves a workplace, and create an indelible record of that. That tells you nothing about the conditions of what's going on. So actually track and trace and blockchain provenance software is not useful for tackling human rights conditions in workplaces. It can, however, be a very useful adjunct to make businesses understand what's going on by suddenly saying, okay, that tuna has been tracked and tagged through that workplace, and that workplace has this human rights score. So you need to bring the two together. They are actually two separate things. Having said that, blockchain is going to be very useful for us in a number of areas. One of which is encryption. There's a much stronger encryption standard built into most of the blockchain protocols. So we're going to be using it for encryption. We're also going to be using it for the tipping system eventually, so that you're not just tipping a workplace and not knowing where the money goes from there, but in fact, you will eventually be able to tip individual, it'll go into individual wallets within that workplace. So that's really quite interesting. But these are long-term projects. They require a lot of money. They require a lot of devs, and volunteer NGOs tend not to have either.
Yeah. And we're just sort of digging down into all through the layers. What if at a particular layer, like Brian, I know you're saying that, you know, you speak to people around, you know, you're getting a whole lot of opinions. If there's layers of suppression and sort of like particularly someone's asked with the prawn boat situation, could you ever dig in that deep? Could that be identified?
Not in a remote monitoring system, no. That's when you send me a contract to go out and kick in a door.
Yeah.
You can't tackle that in any other way except the old way. Which, you know, if you want to do something tech, if you want to do something remote, if you want to do something even remotely scalable, then it's got to be tech. And tech can't tell you which boat has slaves. Tech can't tell you which workers in a mine are in bad conditions and which ones are in good conditions. I've been in mines where one person fits the definition of human trafficked, and that person standing next to them doesn't. How can you pick that up from a satellite? How can you do that with tech? You can't. You just can't. So, which is why we come at it from the other end. With tech, if you want to do it, what we're able to do is prove the prawn boat that doesn't, because we're able to get the data from the workplace that is a good workplace, because we're able to penetrate. If you can't get that penetration into a workplace, then you can't prove bad intent. With the penetration, however, you can prove good intent.
Yep. So with transparency, you're basically proving the positive side of it, so showing that you're doing the right thing, and then
it's purely a positive journey. Exactly. So we can't tell you which bag of prawns not to buy. We can tell you which bag of prawns you can buy, and then you can look sideways at the other one and consider the other. And then the idea is, okay, well, if that happens, if we're telling people which bag of prawns they can buy, it's like a fair trade banana. You know, fair trade doesn't put a label on the bananas that are not fair trade.
Yeah.
Right. You know, you see the banana that is fair trade, and you say, and then you have to make your own assumptions about the other one. And it's the same with this. You pick up 2 bars of chocolate, one of them is slave-free, and then you look at the other one, and then what are you're just wondering. With modern slavery, with slave-free or made in freedom, it's amazing the psychological difference that it makes. Several things happen. Have we got time for me to be talking like this? I don't know.
Yeah, yep, still got time.
Okay, several amazing things happen. One of them is when you see one that has the made in freedom or slave-free tag on it, you immediately look at the other one. The first response is to look at the other one, the one that doesn't have it, and you immediately mistrust it. And then there's also this kinesthetic response. The person who sees the slave-free or the made in freedom feels they have to pick it up and interact with the product. Whether it's a t-shirt or a chocolate bar, they have to pick it up and look. They kind of, what? And then the other thing that happens is if they leave the store, they can't leave with the non-slave-free one once they've seen the slave-free one. So even if they don't buy the slave-free made in freedom one, they can't buy the other one. Super powerful tool.
Yeah. So it hits people in their human emotions.
And subliminally, right?
Yeah.
They're not even conscious necessarily of the way this thinking works.
Yeah. And I want to ask Carolyn, with the drivers of modern day slavery, is poverty considered one of the main factors? And if we were to basically address a whole issue around poverty, would that also address modern day slavery?
Yeah, so one of the drivers, or one of the major drivers of modern slavery would be poverty, along with armed conflict, which leads to displaced people and exodus in terms of refugees as well. And then you're looking at natural disasters, along with a couple of other drivers. So yes, it's important to address poverty, as well as looking at decent work. But in terms of our work, we're largely looking at the other end of the spectrum. So yes, I think if we were to address poverty and create decent work around the world, then it's less likely that we would see such big numbers of people in modern slavery. But given that it seems unlikely that we're perhaps going to solve some of those issues like poverty or conflict around the world anytime soon, we need to look at the other end, which is why it's really important to address the demand, or the consumer demand. So I think Brian is absolutely correct in terms of looking at how do we get consumers to essentially force change. So you need to force people into a position where we're essentially, hopefully, I would think that we would be in a position where we are around sort of caged eggs at this point in time. So where it's previously people are like, oh, it's all too expensive to buy the free range, but now we're in a situation where it's almost accepted that people will only buy cage-free eggs. So essentially, consumers have a big role that they can play by sort of demanding corporations who have the highest sort of capital that they can, and their appetite to terms of looking down through the layers of their supply chain and demanding change. But it's also important that they work with all the layers below to address those issues rather than just cut contracts, because at the end of that contract, it's people. And if you're just cutting off the contract and leaving people in perhaps even more vulnerable situations than they were to begin with, then that's not an ideal situation either, because that's just going to lead people into more precarious employment, which potentially then leads to perhaps a more severe form of modern slavery. So yeah, I think it's really important that consumers get on board to drive change, because unfortunately, I don't think we will solve those bigger issues in the short term.
Yeah, and I think when we're speaking short term, we've got to acknowledge that the world is going through a significant phase of being impacted, and that those people who are already vulnerable are quite likely to be substantially more affected
Yeah.
Particularly, Brian, what you were saying before about, you know, companies that might not have contracts, you know, that just sort of laying off thousands of people as fits the company.
I mean, it's really got to be one of the worst times for risk assessment tools to be the go-to. As I said, risk assessment is like the blunt instrument. It's the candlestick of the murder scene. It's you know, we've been speaking to a company just recently. 1,900 staff have been laid off in a very vulnerable situation in Bangladesh. They were already doing it tough, to be frank, and they've been laid off because a risk assessment tool that was used, the modern slavery risk assessment tool, said Bangladesh, Danam, no, and the CEO in New York just cut the contract. So 1,900 people, during coronavirus, reduced contracts anyway, have been cut, and so they've all had to go back to the hills, back to the places where they come from with no income in their pockets and for with no foreseeable outcome. They are so much more vulnerable to human trafficking and the worst forms of modern slavery because of risk assessment. We've really got to start thinking much more cleverly about the unintended consequences of the seeming solutions to our problems. Risk assessment tools are not it.
Yeah. And I just got to acknowledge the time. We're out of time, unfortunately, and I would like to acknowledge we've had lots of great questions come through that we haven't had time to answer in this session. So what I might do is Brian and Carolyn, I might have a bit of a chat with you, and we might put together a bit of an article around that can address some of the other questions, if that's okay. Speaking of ongoing work with Brian, Data4Good and Brian are going to be working together on slave-free trade. We're going to make sure we've got access to some resources, some data resources.
Great news. This is a good time to deliver that message. Thank you.
Yes. So anyone who's watching who'd be interested in offering your skills, please feel free to get in touch with us at connect@data4good.com.au. And we will be working, as I said, ongoing with Brian on slave-free trade to make sure we can get the most out of that. Make sure that the resulting product is something that's going to make a big difference. So I'd like to say thank you to you both for joining us, but I'd also like to say a huge thanks. I know a lot of the people attending work in this industry. I know they go through a lot of tough scenarios. I know they face a lot of tough situations, and they're things you don't even want to think about, and they're dealing with them every day and finding solutions to make people's lives better. So I wanted to say from the bottom of our hearts, thank you for all the work that all the attendees do, that you, Brian, and you, Carolyn, do to help out in this field. And as I said, we'll try and get some of those questions answered. There were heaps of questions coming through. We'll try and get those answered for you, and we'll send an email out with the recording and some of those answers in the next few days. But I'd like to say thanks very much for joining us. Hopefully we'll see you on the 10th of August to celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day. Thank you very much, everyone.